Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really fun and fascinating and strangely therapeutic conversation with the designer, educator, and my longtime Twitter friend, Mitch Goldstein. Mitch is an associate professor in the School of Design at RIT up in Rochester, New York. He does client-based design work in collaboration with his wife and partner, Ann Jordan, and has maintained an ongoing art practice focused on photograms and experimental darkroom processes. He also co-hosted the really excellent design podcast Through Process for a few years and has written and lectured frequently about his work and design education. And in this episode, Mitch and I talk about all of those things. We talk about design education and especially the classroom critique format and how he's experimented with that. We talk about the term graphic design and our evolving definitions in relationship to that term. And we talk about Twitter and social media and the state of design discourse and why so much of it just isn't that interesting to us anymore and the types of conversations we'd like to see more of. I loved this conversation. Mitch and I have been Twitter friends for 5 or 6 years now. I was on his podcast a few times, and he was on a short-lived podcast project that I did a couple years ago. And he's just been very supportive of my work and has been kind of a mentor to me in a way, I guess. When I started grad school, he and I talked a lot about that and the process and applications. And then when I started teaching, he's offered me advice as I kind of move into that way of working. And I just love talking with him, and I think that we're thinking about a lot of the same things right now, and you'll see a lot of that in this conversation and me just kind of asking him about teaching and my experience teaching for the first time. We recorded this conversation at the end of November, so I was just finishing up a semester that I really had dedicated to teaching. And it was just a really nice, really fun, really thoughtful conversation that could have easily gone on for another hour or so, and I think that you'll enjoy it also. So this is me and Mitch Goldstein. I kind of want to start in kind of a potentially, possibly kind of weird way, because I've heard other interviews with you. I've talked to you before, so I know your kind of overall background. But I don't mean to be too simplistic about it, but I know you studied architecture for a while. I think you did painting, right? Weren't you?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
I'm very curious about kind of how all of those things came together and you realized that graphic design was the way that brought all these other kind of creative endeavors that you were doing. What was it about graphic design, or how did you realize that graphic design was the thing that you were kind of always kind of looking for? You know what I mean?
That's a funny question, because I don't think it was what I was always looking for.
Okay.
I think I started out, out of high school, like a normal 18-year-old at Syracuse architecture. So I actually think I had to defer a year or something. Like I got into like the school, but not architecture, and then eventually got into architecture.
Right.
And I have no clue what it's about now. Like I have no comprehension of where it is, but at the time it was a very highly ranked program. And I think it's still a pretty good program, but it was, I think it was probably like a top 10. So this was in the early 90s, like 90 to 94. And so I got in there and I made a fateful error, which was getting really excited by what at the time was called deconstruction. Oh, right. Which now is like a dead idea, but at the time it was like Daniel Libeskind, Zaha Hadid, Koa Pimmelblau, Eisenman, and at the time none of them had like built anything. Like Libeskind had built the Holocaust Memorial, and that was it. Zaha Hadid had never built anything, and I was like, "Holy shit, this stuff is amazing!" Like I was really into it. The problem was I wasn't intelligent enough to like really understand it. Right. But, I was like, well, obviously I'm 18, so clearly I'm super smart, like an idiot.
Right.
And so it basically just didn't work out. But I was always really fascinated in that. And that stuff kind of stuck with me. And then I did a whole bunch of bullshit that was not interesting and like selling computers and just nothing,
Right.
just like being alive, basically. And then I had done some fine art stuff. I'd always been sort of artistic. I had done some painting, sold like 2 paintings, like not a career, just, a couple of paintings.
Right.
And then a friend of mine had been doing web stuff. And so this is in 90, like I met this guy, Jason, I don't know, mid 90s, maybe in Rhode Island, Providence. I was still in Rhode Island. And he had been doing web stuff and he had been doing websites, which my previous experience with the web had been like Pine, like that email app.
Right,
People don't
right.
know what that is. I don't know if you do. Like an ASCII text email reader at Syracuse in like 1992,
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, so you're like making visual stuff with the web. Like that's new. Like I know it, like I knew it, but I didn't like know it was a thing. And so we were friendly, and there's a couple other people we were friendly with, and he ended up opening this media company that I worked for. And so I spent about a year doing basically web stuff, front end stuff. And I remember very distinctly doing a lot of Flash animation with like Flash 5 maybe. I mean, I'm probably forgetting but I remember being like, oh yeah, timeline keyframe, like really like getting into it. And so at that time I kind of realized like, oh, people like do this as a job. Like this isn't just a hobby, like this is a real career. And it's sort of art and it's sort of creative and it's sort of like stuff that I like, but it's kind of like you can actually make a job out of this.
Right.
Which I know is very obvious, but it just kind of like clicked at some point.
Yeah.
And so I was talking with my dad and he's like, you should really go back to school. Okay. And I'm like, don't be an asshole. Come on. I'm not going to, I don't have money. He's like, no, seriously. You're older. You never know. Just like apply, and I think you're ready. And I was like, yeah, graphic design, it is sort of interesting. I'm kind of into it. And so that's when I got into RISD and ended up going RISD and met my wife and all this other stuff. Right. So the answer to your question is graphic design for me is almost like a, I don't know, like a container for other stuff I care about, which I think is not a new idea. And you've heard that before. So yeah, it's sort of like, I don't know. It presented an interesting place to do lots of different things in a way that was somewhat understandable, because I think that's another conversation we'll probably touch on about what graphic design even is anymore.
Right.
And it just sort of encapsulated a lot of stuff for me.
I mean, that's exactly why I asked that question in that kind of weird way, is because that's something that comes up again and again in these conversations I have, and it's something that I don't think I realized about myself until having these conversations, in that graphic design is this way that I can actually kind of talk about and be into all the other things that I'm interested in. It's that connection point to all of these other things. And I suspected that was the same for you. Did you realize that? Did you know that at the time, or how did you come to kind of realize that?
I think when I started going to school, I'm trying to think. That's a good question, actually. I think that might actually be fairly recent that I've really understood that. I think I there were things at school I was interested in. There was certain faculty doing certain things I was really into. There were certain faculty doing things I wasn't into, as would anybody at a school.
Right.
And it just all sat inside graphic design. But the stuff that I was interested in was actually more like sort of using photography and graphic design. At the time, the department head was Nancy Skolos. Her husband Tom Waddell both teach there, and they've become really good friends since we've left. They were a tremendous influence. I've talked about them many times. And they're sort of mixing like sort of physical constructions and photo setups and things like that with typography and meaning and all that. And so it all kind of sat together for me in sort of a really exciting, interesting way at undergrad. But I thought I was just like a graphic designer. Like that was it. Like whatever that meant in 2006 when I graduated. Since then, I've kind of decided graphic design doesn't really mean a whole lot as a phrase. It's sort of a meaningless phrase. And so for me, it's almost like, I don't want to sound super pretentious, but it's almost like an approach as much as anything.
Graphic design is an approach, you think?
I kind of think so. Like I approach making work for book covers that I do with my wife, Ann Jordan, and I, as a graphic designer, I approach this like photo fine art stuff I'm doing even though it is clearly not graphic design as graphic design, and I sort of approach everything like that. And what that means is a very debatable kind of conversation, but that's kind of been it's almost like a perspective, I think, within a practice in a way.
So this is interesting. I want to come back to this, but I have another question that may or may not connect to this, because I want to talk more about that, because this is something that I think about all the time. But before we get into that, I'm curious kind of when and how you kind of decided. I know you. This is such a weird way to ask this question. I know you and learned about you and know of your work as a designer, but also as a kind of full-time professor. That's as long as we've known each other, that's been your job. I'm very curious about that decision to kind of be a, quote unquote academic, or to be a professor in addition to, or in place of being a full-time designer or working for someone else, or, running a studio.
It was always something I really liked, and I never thought about it. It was never even on the radar. When I applied to get into RISD, it was never a conversation. I never thought this is something I could do, because frankly, me getting into RISD was just totally unbelievable and ridiculous that even happened in a way where I could afford to go. I mean, it was just crazy that was even reality. Like, really, even to this day, I'm like, how did that even happen? So what happened was I entered RISD because I had some credits as an undergrad. I came in the summer, and RISD would I don't know if they still do this, but you could do a sort of like a short summer foundations. So instead of doing a whole year of foundations, you did like a 2-month summer.
Yeah.
We did like 3D, 2D, and drawing, but like in like 6 weeks. And so my drawing professor, this guy, Mark Melhoff, who's wonderful, I was drawing and I wasn't great, but I tried and I gave a shit, and I was 31. So I was sort of more vested than perhaps some people might have been at that time. And I kind of said to him really jokey, like, hey, if you ever need a TA, let me know. And he's like, okay. And I'm like, well, wait, what do you mean? Like, I'm not prepared. He's like, no, you can do it. And I'm like, what? And I was a TA for him in the next fall for his like 2D whatever they call 2D foundation at RISD.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is fun. Like, this is just really interesting and like hard, but like brain hard, not like digging ditches hard, and it was like kind of awesome. And like, I was like exhausted at the end of it, and I was just a teaching assistant. I mean, I wasn't doing anything. And it just was like, hey, people do this. Like, again, it was like that stupid realization, like, oh, this is a thing you can do for your life. Like, you can do this.
Yeah.
And I did one class for him, and then I did another class for him, and I ended up being somebody's teaching assistant for like the entire time I was at RISD.
Oh, wow.
And then when I was a senior, I don't want to misstate this, I think when I was a senior, Doug Scott, another wonderful educator at RISD, been there forever. He also teaches at Yale. He taught the history of graphic design class. Like, famously, anybody who knows him knows the history of design class. And it's like, and this is even now, I think he still uses slides. Like, he's old school, super hard.
Like physical slides.
Like physical slides. That may have changed, but the last time I saw him, he was using slides. Knows everything, no notes. Like, he just goes.
Yeah.
And you're just like, holy shit, this is how is this possible? And the way he would do the history class was he would sort of do lectures and tests, but then there was another section where graduate students would teach sort of a design project. They would do like a timeline based on history, and it has always been traditionally sort of a fairly coveted grad student thing to do. And Doug asked me to do it.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, are you really sure? And he's like, yeah, you can, and I'm like, dude, I don't think this is a good idea, Yeah. And he said, you can do it, and so I did it, and I'm sure I was horrible, but it was just like so exciting and again, like hard, and like the really good version of hard where you're like excited that it's hard. And that was when I was like, I probably want to keep doing this. Like, this is not just like I'm not done.
Yeah.
And so after I graduated, we stayed in Providence and opened up a studio, and I would adjunct at RISD. I adjuncted at Rhode Island College. I was always teaching anywhere from like 1 to 3 classes a semester.
Okay.
And when it came time to start to think about graduate school, which was again so outside of reality that even the conversation, like, Anne would bring it up. I'm like, Anne, come on, we're not. How is that? Come on. And then sure enough, we started really thinking about it. And I knew to do full-time educate, you kind of need the MFA. And we were hitting a point in our work where, I felt like we were doing pretty good work, but it wasn't where we wanted it to be. It just kind of had hit a ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really wanted to sort of elevate and up our game as designers. We wanted the time to really like think and what grad school is like.
Yeah.
And so we both applied and went to VCU.
Right.
And then eventually, it just kind of became a thing where it was like, this is what I kind of want to do.
Okay. And so did you finish at VCU knowing I want to teach? That's where my practice is headed now?
Yeah. I went into grad school knowing I wanted to teach.
Okay.
Because I had been teaching almost what would be the equivalent of a full load many semesters,
right.
but just as adjunct,
right.
which is, as you know, pays right. zero and it's kind of just reality. And so I knew that I really wanted to do it for real. And I had talked to people at RISD about it, friends that I had at RISD who professors that I respected. And they're like, yeah, you could do this. Like, this is something, you're not kidding yourself. Like, you could probably do this. And that was great. So we went to grad school knowing teaching was going to be a thing.
Okay.
And we sort of both were interested in it. And then out of grad school, it just so happened that Anne got a job at MICA.
Oh, right.
And so we were there for a year, and then I got the job at RIT in Rochester, and we kind of had to make a decision. Yeah. And MICA's an amazing school, but RIT represented a little bit more of a lifestyle that we were into, and so that was where we went. Right. And there it is, so.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it was an important moment because even though I'm an educator full time, I'm still a practitioner. Maybe not every day. Right. I really wish it was more often. Yeah. But it wasn't just like, okay, I don't have to make anything anymore.
Right. Well, that's how I kind of wanted that kind of context to kind of frame and connect it back to this kind of graphic design as a lens, because I'm curious about, and I'm asking this completely selfishly because this is kind of what I'm thinking about all the time right now, but I don't want to say the relationships, but the connections or the interactions between your work as a designer and your work as a teacher, and how much overlap is there between those things? Are things that you're kind of wrestling with in your work? How are they making their way into the classroom and vice versa, if at all?
I would say there's almost total overlap.
Okay.
Actually, I would say there is virtually a complete overlap. And what I have learned, and I will say that many times during this talk, I'm sure, what I have learned over my years is that no matter what I teach to my interests. It really doesn't matter what class it is. And I'm learning to not be scared of that. I think that's actually really valuable. Yeah. And so my interests, as you know, are, process and methodology and all that stuff that I'm into.
Right.
And so I am giving students projects. I am talking to the students about their work. I am, sort of referencing things and showing things that I personally deal with, that I have to handle as a practitioner and as an educator. Mm-hmm. And I think that what I've learned is that I am extremely transparent with the students about my motivations, about what I'm caring about, what I'm interested and not interested in. And I think that it's like a total circle because I have ideas about my work. I share them with students, not to say I'm great, do this, but just hey, this was pissing me off and I did a thing and look what happened. Yeah. And then they kind of take that and run with it. And maybe they'll think, oh, I wasn't going to do this, but then I remember you said that thing. And then they make something and I'm like, holy shit, that's really interesting. Yeah. And then I kind of take it, and so it's a total Ouroboros of creativity in the best possible way. And so I have learned to stop trying to really separate them. I think of other than watching Netflix and cooking and paying my dogs, everything else is what I call the work as a phrase, and it's just all the work. And sometimes the work is a teaching, sometimes the work is making a thing. Again, when I go into my darkroom, that's the work. Yeah. And it's me. It's not the way to do it. It's just me. The separations are meaningless, and they actually kind of piss me off. They get in my way. Yeah. And I'm not good at siloing stuff, for better or for worse. I don't think it's always a good thing. Yeah, so that's how I approach it.
This sets up kind of 5 of the big things that I was really interested in talking to you about, and it connects back to this kind of idea of kind of how you think about this term graphic design, because knowing your work and knowing kind of your interest in process and chance and experimentation, I'm very curious, and I see that you tend to be that way as a teacher also, and you kind of encourage that in your students.
Yep.
And I'm very interested in how you think about, kind of bringing your point of view into the classroom while also making sure that the students aren't just mimicking you, but are doing their own thing while also kind of learning the things that they need to learn. You know what I mean?
I got to tell you, that's the question. Right. That is really the question, which is sort of how do you manage that? And I will tell you what I do, but I will preface it by saying I'm not sure I'm very good at it yet. I think I have some skills as a teacher. I mean, I am a good teacher. I know that, but I don't think I've nailed it by any stretch. Yeah. So the way that I do that is I am very, very upfront and very verbal about what I hope the students learn to do. And what I hope they learn to do is to be them. And I literally say that on day one. Like, this class is about you being you. It is not about you imitating me, although some of you might do that. It is not about you imitating Sagmeister, although some of you might do that. It's not about imitating Daniele, although, and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
It's about you learning to really develop your own practice. And so I very much give them projects that are very open, very abstract, very, I think fairly bullshitty, but in a way that there's like sort of value to the bullshit.
What do you mean by that?
Like stuff that seems like kind of silly. Like they do a project where like the project they just did. I'll just tell you an example. Like I'm in the middle of 2D design with freshmen. So these are freshmen from all sorts of different majors. Mostly design majors, but there's like interior design, graphic design, industrial design, new media design, like a whole bunch of stuff. Some photo students are in there. Generally speaking, pretty much all freshmen. And I actually talked with Martin Vinesky, who's another big hero of mine, who you should talk to.
Yeah. I love his work. That's a great,
he's amazing. And he's done this project for a long time where he sort of gives students an object or a couple of objects, and they basically just have to make work. And like that's the assignment. It's like a 1-sentence assignment. Like, here's the thing, make some shit. The point being that, anything is an inspiration and form comes from anywhere. And as you start to dive more and more into this thing, you get more and more stuff it starts erupting into this thing of ideas. And so I basically did sort of a version of that, with his blessing. I sort of did a version of that project because I was so intrigued by it. And you explain this to the students and they're looking at you like, dude, come on. Like, can't I just learn Photoshop or, whatever?
Right.
And I'm like, no, guys, seriously, I swear I'm not messing with you. Just try, And sure enough, some of the work sucks. Some of the students don't get it, but enough of the students get it and enough of the work is interesting where it sort of solidifies that it's a legitimate idea. And I think that the other thing I do is I'm fun in, like, I'm, me, I'm entertaining in some way, but I'm very legitimately serious about it. And so when they bring in something that they think is a joke, I treat it seriously. I remember I had a student, this great student who was a pain in the ass. I love him, but he was a pain. And one of his things, I can't remember quite what the context was, but essentially what he brought in was a big middle finger to me. Like literally to me.
Yeah.
Like, okay, Mitch, you're so fuck you, Yeah. And I treated it, I was like, okay, let's really talk about this. Like, what do you guys think about how is it doing from the, is it meaningful? Is it, and so we had a real crit. And I think he kind of was like, oh, he's not joking. Like, this is actually a thing. And so I think that those moments happen and stuff clicks to them. That's when I think they're learning. The other reason I can get away with that is I'm not the only teacher they're going to have.
Right.
If it was the Mitch Goldstein School of Design, like nobody would do it. It would just be people bullshit. Like nothing would happen. So because they have 30 or 40 other faculty throughout their career, it kind of makes sense for me to teach that stuff. Yeah. So it's kind of like, I think I'm very honest and very upfront about wanting them to really develop agency. I mean, that's another word that I use frequently.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. It's super easy to be cookie cutter nowadays. Very, very simple to be, very derivative. And so what are you going to do about that? And I think that's a big piece of it is having some agency.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't want to turn this conversation into me just asking you about all the questions that I have now teaching for a year of like that I'm trying to figure out. But This is making me think of two things that I've been really wrestling with a lot. I'm about ready to kind of finish up my first semester of teaching Introduction to Typography, which was so much harder than I thought it was for multiple reasons. One, it's their first design class that they've ever taken in the design department. So they don't know anything. They don't have any opinions on, they haven't gotten to these are the good typefaces, these are the bad like they don't have opinions about any of this. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't want to kind of come in and say, these are the typefaces you can use. You should not use these. This is how you do these things to look like design.
Right.
And so I went in, very into kind of what you're saying is this class is about you. I'm not here to tell you what good design is and what bad design is. And the first couple of weeks did not go well because I didn't put any parameters around it. And so they didn't care. And then when I would then be like, well, talking about kerning or something, there was like, well, I thought it was, this is artistic expression. Why does this matter? And so then I kind of had to find that balance between you need to know how to do these things, but there's also not right or wrong answers. And then if I tell you that this stuff doesn't matter, then why are you you know what I'm
right?
And
right.
It's this kind of like back and forth that I've been trying to figure out. And I don't know if that's a question or not.
It's sort of funny you say that, because I was actually just thinking about this today. I think I made a little connection in my brain today about something. And I was thinking about sort of my creative work and how a lot of what both Anne and I do with like sort of the book cover and the publication stuff, and more so what I do in my darkroom with the other sort of work I'm doing, is I frequently feel less like a designer and more like a sort of person who is making circumstances in which design happens. And I know that sounds super art school, but if you'll allow me to elaborate, I'm the way we work with a lot of materials and a lot of methodology and things like that, it's more like we just take stuff off the wall and say, what if you smack these two together? What if we take, a bucket of water and some prisms and a projector, and what'll that do? And it turns out it can do some pretty cool things. So I understand that, yes, I am designing that, but in my brain, we are more like just shoving these things into each other and it's designing itself.
Right.
Now, I know that's not true, but in my head, that's how I kind of think about it. So when I'm in my darkroom and I'm playing around with stuff and I'm just throwing stuff around and making these photograms, I'm not making the photograms. I'm sort of maestroing these materials, and then the photograms are making the photograms.
Right.
And I know that's a very like academic distinction, but the point is that I think I teach the same way. And I think I sort of throw the students into these kind of parameters that they have to then reconcile. And I do that on 5 obstructions based project, which I'm sure we'll chat about at some point.
Yeah.
And that is very much like, I have no idea what these is going to do. No clue if it's going to be any good. No clue if they're ever going to do it, frankly. I have had, not often, but every once in a while, people just like, this is bullshit, and that's fine. And so do I have knowledge? Absolutely. Do I have perspective? Absolutely. I have all those things that an educator has, but I think I have the ability to just sort of like throw them into the pool and see if they can start swimming. Being there to help, being there to assist and being there to guide a little bit. But I kind of feel like that's almost how I teach. So what I'm saying is, like, when you worry about students emulating Jarrett Fuller, you should almost not even teach them. I mean, you're teaching, but you're sort of almost saying, here's some stuff.
Right.
And here's a couple of talks, and we're kind of go make some shit. And we're going to look at these 100 things, and like 2 of them might be interesting.
Well, I mean, so that's the question then is in my experience, I'm curious, because you're saying, most of them kind of get it and end up doing interesting things, but you have a couple people that are resistant. Is for a lot of early design students in kind of that first and second year, they're still I found that students are still in school mode, as in that there's right and wrong answers and what is correct and how do I get a good grade. And so, I'll trying to get them to find their voice, their interests, bring themselves into the project, and they'll be doing something. One of my classes, I have students doing a magazine project. It was like, oh, this magazine that you're making reminds me of this other magazine. You should look at this just to kind of see how they're handling things. And then the next week they come in and have completely just done what that magazine looks like. And I'm like, why'd you do this? And it's like, oh, that example you showed did it this way. And so it's like, oh, no, that's missing the point. So how do you, how do you break students out of that? Or how do you get students to be comfortable in their voice or in being them while taking reference without copying?
Well, I'll tell you, it's very frustrating, I think, for the students. For me, it's actually super fun. Yeah. I think the students, and I hear this all the time, and I've actually had some written reviews with this comment being like, Mitch doesn't tell us if we're doing it right or wrong. Mm-hmm. And I don't tell them that because I'm lazy. I tell them that it's intentional. I frequently, students say, "What is it okay if I do this?" And I'll say, it's a great question, and I'll just walk away. Like I will literally go, "That's a really good question."
I've done that.
And I think when they realize, like, oh, he's not just being funny, like he's actually putting it on me to figure that out.
Right.
Again, I think that idea of agency is so important, and I think it's like I frequently tell my students that like the nature of these projects are you're going to make some of the worst shit you've made in your entire life, even though you're 18. But like you are going to make just awful stuff. And that is okay, because this is a good place to make the worst thing you've ever done.
Right.
And when they see that I'm not kidding, and when they see that, like, they're getting their evals and I'm saying you're doing really well, and they're like, I made all this crap. And then when they see that I'm really serious about it, they start to understand that, like, oh, so Mitch doesn't really care if the thing I made is amazing. He cares that I made the thing, that like I went through that process of the making of the thing, some of which might be amazing.
Right.
And I think that's a really different distinction. And again, it's my own thing of how I teach, for better or for worse. I really, and this is another like day one slide on when I intro the class, is like, I really want them to start at the beginning and end at the end. I don't want them to start at the end. And I think that is a very common foible of designers, is they start at the end. Oh, okay, I get what I'm going to use purple. I'm going to use, veneer and blah, blah, and it's like, no. Go take some prisms and a projector and a whatever and, do this crazy shit. And so I think when they start to understand that I'm not joking and I'm not just screwing with them, I mean, I am screwing with them, but like in a valuable way, they start getting that it's not just about the perfect thing at the end, and that there's more to the conversation than that. And I think your conversation with Elliot Earls, who I absolutely love, and I've talked to him myself, and I've been up to I just love Elliot.
Yeah.
And I think when he talked about how you could sort of learn design in like 6 months, I think he's being generous. I think you can learn it in like 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you're going to be getting good.
Right.
You really, and so there's such a broader conversation to it than is this thing kerned correctly.
Right.
I don't think that's not important, but that's not the conversation.
Right.
That's not what it's about. It's just a byproduct of what it's about. And so I hope, I believe I'm doing this, but I believe that the students are engaging in sort of a critical dialogue with themselves about what they're doing, not just looking for my approval. Because the reality is I'm going to kind of be pretty excited about anything because I'm excited that they're caring enough,
Right.
I'm rarely going to say that's the worst. That's, no, wrong. Like there is no wrong. There's just like, that didn't do it.
Yeah.
But maybe later, maybe 2 years from now, if you have a thing about a whatever, and that's kind of it's like such a mind game in so many ways.
Yeah.
I imagine if you talk to some of my students, they would say I'm probably really frustrating to have as a teacher.
Right.
But I think that it might take a semester, or might even take more than a semester. But I think the majority of them, it clicks for them to some extent. Mm-hmm. And so what I think I'm seeing as my students have been teaching long enough, where they're going out and they're working and they're doing stuff, I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job at getting them to really be them.
Yeah. So
not an imitation.
This is a good place, I think, to kind of talk about the critique, or talk about kind of the classroom critique, because I think that kind of becomes the question then, is what you talk about when everyone's together. And I've, been following you kind of wrestle with the critique format, in public, and kind of the problems with it, and what you're trying to the kind of space you're trying to create for it. And so I kind of have two questions, and you can kind of answer them how you want. And one's kind of about kind of the content of the critique, and the other is the format of the critique, or the space of critique. And so I'm I guess kind of firstly, based on kind of everything you just said, and kind of not giving right and wrong answers, that kerning is not the most important part of this project, which I agree with 100%. What's the content of a critique in one of these classes, and what are the things that are talked about?
That's a really good question. It obviously changes dramatically depending on project to project and class to class. But what I'm learning is that you actually, what I'm learning is that going into a crit and saying, okay, guys, what do you think, is a meaningless question. Even though you and I understand, you could answer that question for 3 weeks you could talk about what I think forever, but like, it's not a tangible question for them.
Right.
What is a tangible question is exactly what does and does not make sense. Can you read this? Does it communicate what you think it's communicating? Is it engaging visually? Is it engaging sort of methodologically? Like, is the way the student got to it interesting? So it's sort of like really specific questions like that. The other thing it is does it remind you of something? I think that's really important, and I know you do that a lot. What does it connect you to? And in literally music, movies, food, a walk, a thing you bought, what is this reminding you of? What is this kind of firing in your brain? And another thing I do, and I'm really torn on this, and I don't know if I should be doing this, because I know some people think this is a huge mistake, but I often will say, name 3 things this student could do next.
Oh, interesting.
I think that is valuable, because what I hope the student doesn't do is say, oh, well, John said to do these 3 things, so that's what I did.
Right.
What I hope the student does is say, oh, that was sort of an idea, and maybe what if I blah, blah, blah. I have heard other people say that, I would have done X is like the least valuable critique there is. Like, it's the meaningless criticism. And so I'm like really torn on it.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks it's really valuable, especially for freshmen who are so worried about doing well and all this stuff.
Right.
Part of me thinks it's sort of a bullshit thing to ask, because it's not your project. So what you would do is, you, the critiquer, is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you would do. So I'm like really undecided how I feel about that question. But the reality is I usually throw it in. I usually ask it. And some students do literally what is suggested. Most students get, it's just like an idea. It's just like a little spark. And so I think the reason why you've seen me wrestle with critique is that I'm frankly not great at it. I really think I'm not very good at it, actually. I care about it tremendously, and the Through Process podcast was primarily about that in a lot of respects. I think that I have a very I find it very difficult to be – I'm trying to think of how to say this intelligently. I find it hard to reconcile the students' questions without dictating the answers.
Right.
I want them to feel a critique is a critique if you leave with an action. If you leave feeling like shit, then that wasn't really a critique. It was just you being belittled or whatever.
Right.
So if you leave a critique with either an action that you have figured out from the critique, or maybe the teacher or a student has suggested an action or some sort of actionable thing, to me, that's a valuable critique.
Right.
If you leave either feeling like you're a superhero or like garbage, that's an irrelevant critique. It's not about your ego. It's not supposed to be about your ego.
Right.
And so I kind of don't want to just tell the students what to do. Obviously, no teacher does. But I also don't want to be like, yup, you're awesome, and then kind of move on to the that's also irrelevant. So I find it really difficult to critique because of that. And that's where all this comes from, is I am trying to get away from the big group crit.
Yeah.
I really think it's dead. I do it when I have to. It's something that I grew up on at RISD. I remember very distinctly, and I've talked with Tom Waddell about this. I was in his, anybody listening who went to RISD, I was in Tom's Making Meaning class, which is this junior level semiotics theory class. It's the first really heavy class where you really have to be on it. And I remember we had RISD classes, it would go from like 1 to 6, and we did a crit from like 1 to like 7:30 with 1 5-minute break.
Oh, wow.
And Tom, who is absolutely incredible, he will go for 10 hours if you let him. I mean, and he's brilliant, and it's not just bullshit. Like, he knows what he's doing. And so I was raised on that. Like, I was like, well, I guess this is what you do. When, we're going to sit around a room and everybody get a coffee and we're going to talk for 5 hours.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be one of these millennials and all that bullshit. It's painful for them. It's super painful for me.
Yeah.
And I don't think it really accomplishes that much because it becomes this performance art idea, which is not really the point. So what I'm trying to do is have the students do more peer-to-peer critique as often as possible without me even being involved, like without me even like overseeing it. And so doing stuff like the speed dating crit, I kind of tweeted about, which has been like I love it. Oh, I love it.
I was skeptical because I read that tweet and I did not think it was going to work. And I'm not just telling you this to curry favor or anything. Right. I did it the next week because I was curious. Best critique of that class.
Yeah. And the students told me flat out it was the best crit they've ever had and all this stuff. They love it. And I want to make sure to go on record as I did not invent that. Okay. I actually heard it from Anne, and I'm not sure where Anne figured it out, but like I did not invent that. I'm not taking credit. And so what I'm finding is that it starts to become really interesting. And this is why teaching is so fun, because it's actually not about me.
Right.
I am the least important person in the classroom. By far. I am by far the least important person in that classroom. And so when it stops becoming about what Mitch said and more about what the sort of class said about my work.
Oh, that's interesting.
What my peers said, what the other people said, what this person thought, not what Mitch thought. Not only do I think they get better ideas because I'm just one person, but I think it's almost like, I don't know, and I don't think this is totally true, but it's almost like, well, this student isn't being paid to teach, and he's telling me something. Maybe I should take that seriously.
Right.
Mitch is a teacher. He's being paid to be here or whatever. Nobody's really said that. And so I kind of feel like it's almost adds a layer of legitimacy to it, even though the counter argument would be, well, this freshman doesn't know anything about being a degree.
Yeah.
I don't totally buy that. I think that we just know different things.
Right.
like they know stuff I don't. I know stuff they don't. And so I think when you sort of, you put this whole past 10 minutes of me been talking together, you put this together, it sort of becomes about like, I don't know, it's almost like a really valuable cocktail party,
Right. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean.
People are sort of milling around and they're kind of into it. So they're talking and I'm just another person milling around and I've been there and I've done a little more and I'm maybe a little older and whatever, but my critique is not inherently better or worse than anybody else. Do I know some more stuff? Of course I do. Have I had more experience? Of course those things are true. But they're getting enough of me. Like they get plenty of Mitch. Especially since so much of my brain is out on Twitter and whatnot that like I'm not a secret, in terms of what's going on in my head.
Yeah.
So I think when they start being sort of held accountable for themselves in a way as both critic and critiquee and critiquer, I don't know. I'm finding it really valuable. I believe it is going really well. I will not know for sure until I've done it for a while. My perception is that an active student who is actively engaged in either getting or giving criticism is much happier than a student who's waiting his turn to go 10 people down later in the big. And some of them have crashed and burned. I did a Post-it note crit, which is again another thing I didn't invent. But you put the work up, and people write. And like I did this. These I thought these students were going to kill me. I asked them. What I'm learning now is to project questions on the screen that they have to answer, not say just tell them what you think. And so that's another really important piece. And I asked these students to answer like 6 questions or something for 18 people. They were going to kill me. Like they were in pain. People were like hurting their hand, And so I'm like, okay, that was not okay. Like that was too much, So I'm certainly dialing it in, but I think it's becoming pretty interesting.
And it's this comes back to the idea of the group crit becoming this kind of performance art where it allows the students who, are less outgoing to give feedback. And so it gives them, they get that kind of place to talk in. Sometimes in a group, they're not comfortable. But then, giving the critique individually, you might hear the same piece of feedback 5, 6, 7 times, which in a group you hear that once and then no one else, 7 other people were thinking that, they're not going to say it again. And you're like, exactly. Okay, here's this thing. This came up again and again.
Yeah.
This is actually a really good place to go back to the conversation we started at the beginning about, this idea of kind of graphic design as this container or this approach as opposed to, a thing that you make. And the reason that I, am thinking about it is how you teach, but then also in the critique, in the time of critique, how you talk about graphic design, this thing that they're studying, is not just about making stuff look good or look cool, but it is about process. It is about communication. It is about points of view. It's about all of these other things also. Two questions. One kind of perspective of the student, and then from you. Is that hard for students? Do you find that hard for students to get sometime, especially now when so many people have versions of Photoshop when they're a kid and they think, they know how to use Photoshop, so they're a graphic designer, and then you kind of mess with that a little bit.
Yeah.
And then how do you kind of introduce these other ways to think about it kind of in the classroom?
Well, I mean, one of the first things I often say in sort of freshman classes is that, like, look, I'm sorry to break this to you guys, but graphic design is really easy. Like, it is really, really easy. It's very hard to do really well. But the 13-year-old who, like, made a flyer for a garage sale in Microsoft Word, if you can convince me that isn't graphic design, like, I'll eat my hat. Like, it is absolutely graphic design.
Yeah.
And so the point of entry on this is almost nothing. I mean, it's zero.
Right.
So, and I always say this line, like, a really hard job to be mediocre at is like an astronaut. Mm-hmm. That's a tough job to be shitty at. Right. But you can be a shitty graphic designer in 5 seconds. Like, that's really easy. And so you guys have to realize that it's about so much past the tools, and people are just so, like, worked up about software. And I know that we're at kind of a higher level of dialogue with it, and we're kind of over it. But so many students come in and they think it's about being really good at Photoshop.
Right.
That I can't believe that's even real. I can't believe that's actually even a trope I have to deal with, but it really is.
Yeah.
I've had students say to me, I don't need this class. I know Illustrator. Like, I'm good. And I'm like, dude, come on.
Yeah.
And so I think that the reality is, and I don't know if we've talked about it or like you and Rory have talked about it, but like not every design student is going to go make a design podcast because they care that much. You know?
Right.
Some students are just going to go get a job as a designer. And you know what?
Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
And I am so happy that you're making a living as a designer, doing whatever. If you're making a living and it says graphic designer, like, you're incredible. Like, you have already hit a home run.
Right.
In whatever way. If you then go past that into a higher level of dialogue, obviously that is where I have some interest. But that doesn't mean you have to. That doesn't mean it needs to be about that.
Right. But do you I don't know how to ask this question without it sounding weird. Do you feel, I mean, I guess this kind of comes back to that tension between, kind of teaching them right and wrong, but also letting them find their voices. Like, how do you show that you can just be a graphic designer and you can just kind of, do this stuff, and that's great, and we need people to do that, but then there's also this other stuff that you can do also, and both of those, how do you kind of cater to both of those so you're learning the things you need to learn but also kind of opening up all of these other things?
To be totally honest with you, probably not very well.
Okay.
To be honest. Yeah, I mean, really, and I mean, I'll be very blunt. I think that students, like, the good students in a class, I think with me do really, really well. Like, I think I get them past where some other instructors may be able to get them. The students, like the bottom quarter of the students, I think I'm actually a horrible teacher for those students. I'm too out there. I'm a little too processy. I'm too intangible. And I know it, and it's a problem. And I've said this before, and I admit it, and I cop to it, that it's just, I don't know how to hit 100% of the spectrum in a given class.
Right.
And again, the way I can sleep at night, the way I can be, okay with my look in the mirror is that they're going to have 30 other people teaching them over the course of their career. It's the only way I can reconcile it. And so I think it's a problem, honestly, because again, it comes back to me teaching to my interests. Like, I'm not interested in sort of bread and butter, nuts and bolts graphic design. It's totally great. It's legit. Yeah. It's important. It matters. I'm not belittling it in any capacity. It's just not where my interest area is. And so I think that I'm pretty honest with them about that. Like, I am pretty upfront with what I care about and what I don't. And, I'm very, I think we had this, I just had this conversation with somebody about social media and teaching and stuff. And I'm like, I actually really like it when they see me on social media, not because of my ego, but because they understand what I do and don't care about. And it's no other reason. I don't care about them liking my tweets or anything like that. They just get what I'm talking about. And so, I've said a million times that I am not a problem solving graphic designer. That phrase makes me want to vomit. I don't think it doesn't count. I don't think it isn't legit. I just don't care about it. It is just not my area of interest. And I freely admit that I am not a problem solving person.
Yeah.
And so when the students realize that, then they're not pissed they're not learning problem solving in my class, because they go, okay, well, Mitch isn't that person. That's fine.
Right.
And that's the thing I think that I see now as a teacher that maybe when I was a student I didn't get, was that, the teachers are people and they have things they do and don't care about as designer,
Right.
And so when you come up to me with some really cool app for a whatever thing bullshit stuff, I'm like, yeah, sweet. Whatever. Hey, did you see this thing I did with Jello in my darkroom? And so there's a disconnect there, right? And that's totally fine. And I think that the teachers that I've always really liked were really honest about who they were. They were really legitimate and very upfront about what they did and did not like and care about and stuff. And so I think it's really important to be very truthful with your students about where you're at. I think it's fair. I think it's just, it's sort of it's necessary. I might even say it's ethical. I think it's ethically valuable to do that.
I mean, the way you answered that actually kind of made me think about something that I was not thinking about. Again, you kind of connected some things that I hadn't fully thought about. And I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned very early on about this idea of graphic design being kind of this dead term, or this term that's kind of doesn't carry any weight anymore. And I feel like that's so much of my work is in kind of wrestling with that question, not to find an answer, but because that question in and of itself is interesting to me. And I think that's why I went to grad school, and I think that's why I'm interested in design criticism. I think that's why I'm interested in teaching. It all comes back to, what does this term actually mean? And I think if I've grown at all in my 2 years of grad school, or in the year and whatever of doing this podcast, it's not being so dogmatic about these. And that a couple years ago, I think I would have said that graphic design as problem solving that's not what graphic design is. But that can be graphic design, and it can be this other thing, and it can be this other thing, and it can be making a podcast, and it can be whatever. And I think, when I talked to Jeff Keedy, he also talked about this idea of graphic design. What falls under the umbrella of graphic design has become so expansive that those two words together don't mean what they're taught, what they were, in the kind of Paul Rand era. It just doesn't work anymore.
Right.
And so I say all that not to kind of, talk about myself, but how you've come to think about that, or how you've arrived at that kind of, or your own relationship to that term. Even.
Yeah. It's a really tough question, and you're catching me at a very interesting time. Okay. Not at 8:30, but at in my life, in the calendar, because I am really in love with graphic design and graphic design and so quote I'm air quoting graphic design in so many ways, but like the sort of like masturbatory like conversation on Medium about what it is and should we code and just all the stupid bullshit, which I am a horrible person for even tweeting it, but I do it anyway. You know, like these stupid tropes. It's just kind of not. I'm just kind of like, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but like I'm just not interested in it. It's just not interesting anymore. I'm super interested in the conversation more about my arts practice. And I have said to you, I know I've said this to you, the art design difference is not a difference I personally choose to care about.
Yeah.
I have changed that slightly to say, yes, there is a difference, but I still don't care what it is. Are they different things? Yes, I don't give a shit what that difference is. And the reason why I say that is because what I have found is that it isn't about inclusion, it's about exclusion. Oh, that isn't graphic design. That's just art. That stuff you're doing is just, that isn't design. You're not solving somebody, you know, and so is graphic design problem solving? Sure. Is graphic design a poster for a movie? Sure. Is graphic design a 13-year-old making a flyer in Microsoft? Sure. It doesn't matter. Like, okay.
Yeah.
Fine. What are you doing? What are you doing? And that, for me, I'll tell you, again, back to Elliot Earls, once again, mad props to Elliot Earls. In his studio practice series, he one of his episodes, and this hit me like a brick. He says right out, he's like, and you know how Elliot is, he's very Elliot. You know, he says, he's like, I'm sorry to say this to y'all, but like it isn't about what your teachers say, it's about what your teachers do.
Right.
And that just, I literally sat down. When I had to stand. I'm like, oh shit. Right. Like he's right.
Yeah.
And what you say and what you do, I mean, what you do could be writing and you know, it's not about words, but it's like, it's not about the sort of language around the thing. It's about the thing.
Yeah.
And so that really struck with me when he said like, and that was I don't know how that must have been a year or two ago, but that really floored me. And I'm like, oh shit. So maybe like clever tweeting about graphic design isn't really graphic design, you know, or whatever it is.
Right.
And so that was a big moment for me when I kind of clicked into that.
I'm 100% on the same page. I like we're speaking the same language here, I think, in a lot of ways. And, you know, speaking of Elliot Earls, something that I said in that interview that I actually ended up, I mean, this is so weird to talk about that interview and talk about something that I said in it that I thought about a lot. But he got me to say that I don't actually read a lot about quote graphic design. And that's not something that I ever kind of consciously realized until that conversation. And I've thought about that after and felt, you know, a little bit self-conscious about, you know, here I am kind of putting out, you know, quote unquote content about graphic design, but I'm not actually consuming any much else. And I
feel the same way, by the way.
Okay.
I feel the exact same way because I am teaching graphic design and I'm teaching graphic design or pre-graphic designers to be graphic designers. And I'm not sure how interesting graphic design is anymore.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, it is interesting. Like I love it, but I don't understand how I love it.
Right. I mean, yes. You know? Yes. I mean, that's exactly it. And that's kind of, you know, the should designers code, I don't care about. Design versus art, I don't care about. Like, you know, is why Helvetica is better than Arial, do not care about. Like, over Comic Sans jokes. Like, I don't, and I'm kind of talking about all of this because I'm always kind of wrestling with what is the value of this type of the type of discourse that I'm trying to do. Does that even matter if, and I'm not kind of talking down at the should designers code Medium articles, but if that's what the profession wants, is there value in this other thing? And the reason I'm asking you that is because I think you've made kind of a conscious decision to be a voice in design culture at large through kind of your public persona. And I don't mean that to kind of sound sound cheap, but
for what it's worth. Yeah.
You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
That you're participating in that. What is the value, or what are you trying to do, or what kind of things are you looking for in these kind of public discussions? Do you know that was like a weird question, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. God, that's a really good question. I don't know how to answer that because despite appearances, I have actually sort of a love-hate relationship with like being on the internet. And I don't think I'm the only one who's feeling like that right now. And I'm talking beyond the sort of toxicity of our political climate right now. Beyond that, right. I love the interaction with social media. I love sort of quote unquote knowing people on Twitter, whatever that means. I mean, we met on Twitter,
right.
Yeah. So again, whatever knowing means, right?
Yeah.
I love that. And I hate to admit it, but I love when I get 1,000 likes on something. It makes you feel amazing. Like it's super awesome. It's totally pathetic and it's totally ridiculous and it feels great.
Yeah.
But what is the value of that? I am starting to think there is little to none. Because me knowing Jared Fuller on Twitter is meaningless unless Jared Fuller and I then have a conversation and you're on my podcast, I'm on your, this is like the fifth time we've talked. Right. Like that is valuable. But you retweeting one of my bullshit font jokes, where's the value there?
Right.
And I mean, it's like kind of funny, but it's kind of a serious question too. I really am torn by the answer to that question because part of me thinks if I spent as much time making shit as I did tweeting shit, I would probably have a much better portfolio.
Right.
And again, not the first person to have said that. But if I was making shit and not tweeting shit, you and I would not be friends.
Right.
So there's like value to it in lots of really weird ways. And I think what I'm starting to get, as in my old age, is that you have to sort of take it all with a grain of salt. And it comes kind of back to like that idea of Eliot saying, it's what they do, not what they say.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean what they say is totally irrelevant, but like you have to sort of contextualize that. And so my fear, and it really is a fear, is that all I'm doing is tweeting about making design and not making design or art or whatever the word is.
Right.
And so I am hyper aware of that. Hyper aware of that. And so I don't know how to answer that question because I don't know what I am adding to the conversation. I mean, I think much of what I tweet is pretty legitimate and it's really what I think. I'm not just writing it to get a tweet, like that whole critique thread and some of those like Dear Design student tweets, like that is like, I'm not just doing that to be popular. Like I really believe it. And the fact that other people react to it and enjoy it is, to me, valuable because I assume they're doing that because they think it's valuable. And so that helps me. Like I'm tweeting as much to explain to myself what I'm doing as to anybody else. The problem is, am I tweeting for the retweet or am I tweeting to really have a thought that I think is important? And the answer is sometimes it's both. Right. And I think that's a genuine problem. And I think that's actually kind of toxic. And so I am in like a really weird place with Twitter right now. I am really undecided how I feel about it. And I'm really undecided with what my role is there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've really earned the right to have as many followers as I do or be listened to the way I apparently am. And again, I hope I'm not being like I'm really being.
Yeah, no. I know what you mean.
I don't know if I've earned the right for that at all. But at the same time, I've also spent more time thinking about this than anybody I know. So, like about teaching design, like I'm really serious about it.
Yeah.
So it's like a really weird place to be right now. It's a really hard place to be, and I don't know how I feel about it. And that's totally putting aside all the sexism and all the harassment and the Nazis and the Trumps and all that. And like just putting that aside for a second, just the reality of that, I don't know how to feel about it.
Okay, so let's take it off of Twitter or off of social media for a second, because you also you had a podcast that has 30 something episodes. Your website has a series of longer form essays that are longer than 140 characters.
Right.
You speak at conferences, so you do see some value in talking or reflecting on the work and not just making all the time. And so what is that value, or what do you get from those outlets, or how do those kind of feed back into the making?
That's an interesting question. And since I've started doing, again, what we'll call art, for lack of a better word, again, we know my feelings on that word. This stuff in the darkroom that I'm doing, making, it's purely formal. It's just about the making. There's not meaningful. It's not about gender. It's not about politics. It's about making shit in a darkroom. That is 100% of what it is about. And I really wrestled with that for a while when I started doing this a couple of years ago, because somebody would say, oh, so what's your work about? And I couldn't really answer that question. I'm like, it's about making photograms. Like, it's not about anything. And so what I realized is that that's actually disingenuous. It is about stuff, and it's about how I approach making things.
Right. Yeah.
So the content of my work is the way I make the work. And that is not bullshit. That is legit. The content of my book covers is about the content of the books that they cover. Right. That is also legit, right? Right. And so those are both equally valid ways of thinking. And it took me a really long time to understand that. And so what speaking does for me, and what writing, and I haven't really written a lot in a long time, but like what the speaking at conferences does for me, giving lectures does for me, which I truly enjoy. So they're just super fun. But what it does is it forces me to explain what I'm doing first to me and then to them.
Right.
And I have found that really interesting, because what I finally learned about myself is that I need accountability. If you give me a room and a year, I will not do anything. Like, I just want, I need to have a show or an exhibit or a talk or something happening to be accountable for it, because I'm a horrible procrastinator.
Right.
And so for me, the value is as much about me understanding what I am doing, and then I hope other people seeing it and maybe getting a spark and getting an idea and getting an insight that maybe they didn't think.
Yeah. This I think is a nice place to kind of head into the kind of series of questions that I kind of ask everyone, because we're circling all of these questions anyway. So I kind of think it would be nice to kind of just ask them directly. And what should designers be talking about in this kind of public forum that we're kind of talking about right now? Even if it's not should designers code, or why these typefaces are better. What are the issues? And this could even just be the things that you're kind of thinking about in your own work, or that you're finding in teaching. But what are those things people should be kind of talking about or thinking about or wrestling with right now?
Well, I think the important answer to that is really, gender equality and ethics, and sort of using design for good and not for evil and all that stuff. And I think that is an extremely important thing. And I have no idea how to talk about it. And I have no idea if my opinion on it is even valid as an opinion. Like, I am truly humble about that. I don't think it's fair for me to have an opinion on gender disparity, because I have no experience with it as a man. None. Right. I think it's really important. The not important answer, but the answer that I think is actually what I care about, and I think that stuff is important and it really does need to be talked about, but the stuff that I actually have interest in is more about sort of self-expression in design, and I think more about like ownership of the process, ownership of the ideas, and like, ownership of sort of the methodology in design. And that is why so much of what my interest is in process. Like, that is the thing, the word that matters to me is process, much, much more so than product. And so what I hope my students are doing, and I hope people are doing who listen to me, for better or for worse, what I hope they're doing is they're learning to like not do it how I do it, but to do it how like they do it, and to like learn how they do it and then do that.
Yeah.
That is, when that happens, that's a wonderful moment. It's super flattering when a student's like, oh, I saw you scan stuff, so I scan stuff. It's like, okay, look, you're getting on my good side and you're awesome. But, like, that's not the point here, And so I hope people are talking about that, and I hope that that's becoming a thing that people are really learning. I was just speaking with a friend, and she was like, so much work is so samey, like it's just so samey.
Yeah.
And it's super boring. Like to see it, it's just so derivative of each other.
You've mentioned kind of people throughout, but who are the people, the books, the artists, designers, writers who have really influenced you and your thinking around all of these things, or who's on the reading list you would give out?
Right. Now I knew you were going to ask that because you're predictable
Yes.
in your podcasts. I mean, I think for me, and I've said this 1,000 times, the movie The Five Obstructions is such a massive influence for me that I cannot overstate enough how important it is. And that was shown to me Matt Monk, this guy Matt Monk, who now is, I don't know if he's still the dean of VCFA in Vermont, which Ian Lynham, who I think you talked to, right? That's his thing. Matt, when Matt was my degree project advisor at RISD, he said, you should probably watch this. And I have never been so face melted by something in my life. So that is, I can't stress enough how important that is to me. And unfortunately for my students, they have to deal with it because they do a project based on it. And in fact, they're doing it right now. The real answer to that question is not a whole lot of graphic design.
Yeah.
To be totally honest, I'm not. I can't spit out a bunch of names of graphic design that I'm interested in. I'm becoming really.
That's okay. That's a better answer.
Yeah, I'm becoming super interested in like actually video essays, and that's why when Michael Beirut talked to you and you were like, oh, I should do more. I'm thinking like, yes, you should do more.
Yeah.
Like I really love like Nerd Writer.
Oh, yeah.
I think is really doing. He's super. I really like his approach. I think cinema and movies is something I'm just really fascinated by, just in general. I don't quite know why exactly, but I love those conversations about movies and stuff.
Yeah.
I really like. There's a PBS series called The Art of the Art Assignment that I really like a lot, which is really interesting, and it's sort of changed a little bit in what it's done. I actually just last night, we're talking on a Saturday night right now, and Friday night I watched the Jim Carrey, Andy Kaufman documentary that just came on Netflix. Have you seen? Did you?
I've been waiting for it. I didn't realize it was out already.
It just came out. So
okay.
Nobody's seen it yet but me.
All right. Yeah, that's what I'm doing after this then.
That was really interesting and really like I was just watching it thinking, all right, whatever. And then I was like, oh, there's some interesting shit going on in this.
I've been so
like stuff like that is really interesting. I kind of am more into, I don't know, I feel like I'm like a bad consumer in some ways. Like I think I should be spending more time. Like I tweeted at you the other day, like, hey, who's a reading list?
Oh, right.
It's like a curated reading list because, I read at night when I go to bed every single night, but I read garbage. I read, Stephen King, which isn't garbage, but it's like just fun stuff. It isn't like intelligent stuff. I'm right now reading the new Andy Weir novel, who did The Martian, which is like, I heard it was horrible, but it's super fun.
Yeah.
So and so I don't know. I'm almost like, I know this is going to sound sort of anti-intellectual, and it's not meant to sound that way. I almost think for me, I need to spend less time consuming and more time producing. And I think that is, and consuming for me ends up being more like sort of Netflix and stuff than like really good books, which is what it should be. Right. So my answer to that is almost like, I almost want to say to you, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It does matter, but it's almost like wrong question, but I totally know why you asked the question because it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like what you said, kind of asking about the reading list. I mean, it's totally why I asked this question is because I want to find new stuff. And
I mean, not to blow smoke up your ass, but this podcast is great. I really am so happy that you've gotten to this place, and I'm so we've been friends for a while, and I'm like genuinely just delighted that you're getting to do this. I really am.
That means so much to me. I'm not just reciprocating the compliment, but your through when you did through process, I had been interested in podcasts for a while and thought that there was something design related, and then you guys did that, and I was like, this is interesting, and I think in a weird way has kind of influenced where this has gone. And so kind of knowing that you like this just means
Oh
so
yeah,
much.
it's fantastic. It really is.
I mean,
It's great.
yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so glad we got to do this. Obviously,
Yeah.
you have been on my list since I had the idea to do this. And so now, whatever many episodes later,
Thank you
I'm
for
glad we
having
got to
me.
do this.
Yeah.
This was so fun.
Me too. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on November 18th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.